We begin here in Ottawa tonight with reaction to comments from RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki. In a series of interviews yesterday, she would not say there is systemic racism in the police force and that she's, quote, struggling with that term. The Prime Minister was asked if he agreed with Commissioner Lucki. Here's what he had to say.
That phrase, the system's not broken, it was made this way, is a very difficult thing for people within positions of authority, within systems, to recognize. It's difficult for me, as the Prime Minister, to recognize that the Government of Canada is regularly guilty of systemic discrimination.
I want to bring in Perry Bellegarde to discuss all of this. He's the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He joins us from Ottawa. Hi, National Chief Bellegarde. Good to see you.
Good to be here, Vashi.
National Chief, let me start with the very simple question that my colleague Rosemary Barton posed to Commissioner Lucki. Do you think there is systemic racism in the RCMP?
Oh, of course. I don't think we should even be having that discussion or dialogue. It's been proven time and time again. We need to move beyond whether or not there is racism and or systemic racism within the RCMP and start focusing our attention on how do we fix it. It's been proven time and time again. So there's no question. I don't think we even need to raise that question. And I think if you want to combat systemic racism, you need systemic change. And the first thing is having the power and the authority of those people that are in those places of power and authority to acknowledge it and say that, yes, it does exist. And let's put our heads and minds together on how we fix it.
Is it a problem that Commissioner Lucki cannot acknowledge that?
Well, of course, because 4 years ago, I can remember very clearly the day when former Commissioner Paulson came to our Chiefs in Assembly in Niagara in 2016. And he had the courage and the fortitude to admit publicly in a Chiefs forum that, yes, indeed, there is racism within the RCMP. And we lifted him up and acknowledged him for that because it takes a lot of courage. Because as a head of the RCMP, you're supposed to defend the force and defend the organization. But he knew very well through his experience that there was something wrong within the RCMP. And he admitted it. And that was 4 years ago. So I don't believe within 4 years the system has changed or racism, whether it be overtly or systemic, has been eradicated. So we've got a lot of work to do.
I want to focus with you, of course, on what can be done to eradicate it. But first, you saying that, reminding me of what former Commissioner Paulson said. I remember covering that. And I remember some of the backlash from RCMP members who felt as though the commissioner saying that at the time was labeling them as racist. And in fact, many of the people who have been defensive about that concept of systemic racism over the past few weeks have often cited, hey, that doesn't mean, I don't believe that everyone is a racist. Don't label us all racist. But I think it's important to maybe explain and get your perspective on the system being racist doesn't necessarily mean everybody is a racist. It means, what does it mean from your perspective? What is systemic racism?
It's the way the institution itself has been built on foundations of racism and stereotypes. I have 3 brothers that are retired RCMP members, and they're retired. First Nations people that have been in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they're retired right now. And I've talked to them whether or not there's racism systemic or not. And they have some very amazing and interesting perspectives and stories that indeed there is. And so it's like it's not everybody that's in the RCMP is a racist, but the system itself. In terms of how you recruit, how you select, how you police, how do you do promotions? All of these things need to be reviewed and looked at. So again, back to my earlier point, we should not be having whether or not the question if there is systemic racism within the RCMP. We should be beyond that by now and figuring out solutions to address it.
When we think about solutions to address it, when you think about solutions, what are things that we should be focusing on?
Well, I've always said we need more First Nations people in decision-making authorities around board tables and more First Nations commanding officers. Having an advisory board to the RCMP made up of civilians, more First Nations people in oversight, independent policing review bodies. We could have tighter review in terms of recruitment selection, a tighter process, to weed out racist attitudes and views of these potential RCMP members. We could start looking at, rather than sending RCMP members in when you're dealing with mental health issues, maybe you should have a de-escalation force put in place, so start realigning resources where they're really needed. Because I think of what happened to Chantel Moore. Like this young First Nations lady was shot at 5 times for a mental health check. And so we can start looking at maybe there should be a realignment of resources going forward. So better training, better recruitment, more First Nations involved in decision-making authorities. All of those things can happen. So we need to really reach out and start working together to address the racism issue. But the first thing is to acknowledge that it's there and then start working together to fix it.
Do you think that when you talk about, for example, a realignment of resources, there is this discussion happening right now about defunding the police, and whether or not that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, stopping all funding, but it means redirecting a lot of funding towards something like mental health resources or housing or things like that. Do you think reform can happen from within, or do you think that something like that needs to happen?
All of the above. Now, you need to start looking at realignment of resources, no question. And you also have to look, in our case, looking at policing as an essential service, you know, and making sure it's community-based, community-focused, and that the police are part of the family and community that's out there. You don't need anybody from outside coming in a lot of times just to start enforcing the law and picking up people. So community-based policing, but getting policing seen as an essential service is key, making sure that there's culturally relevant services and programs provided and some sensitivities surrounding it. And so even as we start moving towards restorative justice and overhauling the system, it does begin with police. But then you also have to look at courts. You have to look at probation workers. You have to look at judges. Like, the whole system has to start recognizing that in addition to common law and civil law, there's also First Nations law that has to be respected as well in this country. And so there's a lot of work to do. And so the police is a part of it. And I think the whole realignment of resources should be a discussion that should be had, especially when you start looking at proper de-escalation services and programs and to deal properly with mental health issues or drug addiction issues, you know? So those things can be looked at.
You mentioned right before I asked you that question that all those solutions need to come following the acknowledgement, right, that this problem exists and the degree to which it exists. Do you think that reform can take place in the RCMP under this commissioner, given her comments?
Well, we're going to keep, as always, you can't change anything unless you have access and dialogue and communication. You're not going to change a person's mind, or you're not going to have a new policy or piece of legislation unless you have dialogue and communication. And so I'll continually reach out to make sure that we have that dialogue and communication and start working together to fix it. And we'll extend our hand out to do that with the RCMP commissioner, with Minister Bill Blair, with the whole cabinet. Because in order to get better policy and better legislation, you need to cooperate, you need to communicate, and educating people about this is real. You know, too many of our people are getting hurt and are dying at the hands of police. And we view it that police are there to serve and protect everyone in this country, including First Nations people. And so we've really got to put our heads and minds and hearts together to work together to get to that space where things can be changed. And I said before, systemic racism exists. You need systemic change to fix it.
The premiers are getting on a call tonight that they do every week with the Prime Minister in the vein of accountability in this and on this part of the conversation. They will be, according to the Prime Minister, talking about body cameras. And you know that he expressed his support for equipping RCMP officers with them. I know that it's not, you know, a fix-all, be-all, end-all, but are you in support of that measure?
Again, that's one of the things. You're not going to have a silver bullet here, but having body cams it's transparency. You know, there's pros and cons to everything. Do the review. Let the experts assess it. There's good things about it. There's bad things about it. Is that the most effective way to deal with things? Can those resources be used in a more effective way? I look to the experts for that, but that's one of the things that should be discussed. Even, you know, in terms of there's talk about outlawing the chokeholds again. Mm-hmm. You know, so there's a range of things that can be looked at. That's one of the things that should be discussed, no question.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I appreciate your time very much, National Chief Bellegarde. Pleasure as always to have you on the program.
Thanks for the opportunity, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.